This is a special episode of the Expert Series podcast from the CDA Institute, Canada's premier defense and security think tank. I'm Josh Malm, and it's Tuesday, November 18th, 2025.
The budget it provides a significant amount of investment in the defense portfolio over the next few years. It indicates that the Carney government is taking a pretty radically different approach to defense spending than governments we've seen really since the 1950s. And this is going to be accompanied by a fairly significant investment by the government in Canadian industry. And that is just something that we haven't been used to since the mid-Cold War.
Canada's Parliament has narrowly approved Prime Minister Mark Carney's first federal budget, allowing his minority Liberal government to avert an early election. The 2025 federal budget commits an additional $81.8 billion over 5 years to strengthen Canada's defense capabilities, with a focus on modernizing military equipment, expanding digital infrastructure, and sustaining current defense assets. To unpack the significance of the budget for Canadian defense, we're joined once again by Dr. Philippe Lagassé, Barton Chair at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. So Dr. Lagassé, thanks for joining me once again.
Thanks for having me, Josh.
To start off our conversation, I was wondering if I could get your initial reaction to the budget and what your biggest takeaways were.
Overall, I'd say the budget is very ambitious on the defense side. So we're looking at $81.8 billion on a cash basis that is planned to be spent over the next 5 years. A notable portion of that, about $20 billion, is going to personnel, so salaries and recruitment and retention efforts. We have another approximately $11 billion going to build the CAF's digital infrastructure, $17 billion for other capital projects, and perhaps the most interesting piece looking forward is $6.6 billion for the defense industrial strategy. We also got hints in the budget about where some of that defense industrial ambition is going to lie, but to get the details on that, we will need to wait for the actual strategy itself.
From your perspective, how do you assess the scale and ambition of the commitments in terms of their potential impact on Canada's capabilities, as well as our strategic posture on the global stage, especially at a time when the world is becoming increasingly more unstable?
It is highly ambitious. There's no question of that. When you look at the digital infrastructure piece, for instance, this is long overdue and is required to really get the CAF into the full 21st century. We've been lagging behind in terms of that digital piece for quite some time, and it's going to be fairly critical for new capabilities, AI, quantum, really robust cyber defenses, and the ability to interoperate at the higher levels with a number of our allies, notably the United States, when it comes to the transfer of certain technologies and information between platforms. Equally important on the capital piece, more generally, we're seeing a real investment in filling of gaps. So the budget outlines certain capability investments where there was a lack of funding that was really necessary to top up. But I think it's important for listeners to know that we're only really seeing the surface here in the budget. This is a really significant amount of money over a 5-year period, and then presumably going forward as well. So the overall increase in spending is quite sizable, and the budget obviously can't do it justice. So we're going to have to wait for some additional information, both on the defense industrial side, but also presumably with a future defense policy.
Given the scale of the investment, as you said, just over $80 billion over the next 6 years or so, how do you envision balancing the need for immediate procurement versus long-term strategic goals? And is there a risk that the pace of spending could outstrip our capacity to keep up, or rather Canadian industry's capacity?
There is a risk that you, particularly on the Canadian defense industrial side, where you're trying to both build up Canadian defense industrial capacity and buy more Canadian within the defense portfolio. How well those two are going to align within the time frame that's been laid out is going to be interesting to see. I think it is possible. It is doable. But it's going to require a lot more partnership between industry and government in key capability areas. And as well, we're going to have to see some clear direction from the government to the CAF, because the CAF may not be naturally inclined to buy Canadian as a first matter of course. And again, equally important, when the Defense Investment Agency was stood up, part of the background material that was provided around that was that contracting and in Canadian industrial considerations were now going to be part of the requirement setting process within DNDCAF. So that may help ensure that Buy Canadian and the Canadian defense investment it aligns with what is going to be acquired, but there's going to be some growing pains there, I anticipate.
On the topic of Buy Canadian, I'm wondering, in your view, how the government might be able to craft some kind of Buy Canadian policy that ensures higher operational advantages, but still might give domestic companies a fair chance to compete. And, on top of that, could there be unintended consequences of such a policy, and how might it be mitigated?
Well, look, I personally think that there is a bit of a trade-off in terms of the higher end capabilities that are at the very highest part of the technological spectrum, simply because the United States vastly outspends any other country in terms of defense R&D and what it's doing in that area. So I think there is a reality check here. And I even think it applies to the digital infrastructure piece, where we'll want to buy Canadian more in a number of areas, but we won't be able to entirely move away from the United States. And in the past, the Prime Minister has hinted that he wants the percentage of what we buy from the United States to go down from 75%. Where it should land has been unclear. Is it 60%? Is it 50%? But I anticipate that we still will acquire some of our higher end military capabilities from the United States. The question just becomes then, what can we do more of in Canada? One of those areas would be, I think, uncrewed systems, space, a lot of other startup zones and cutting edge technology where we could really build out a new capability, sensing, for instance. So there's a lot of potential here, and I don't think it's an either or between buying higher end classic platforms and systems from the United States and encouraging more Canadian development in some new emerging areas.
Export potential, I think, was clearly a major component of the strategy if you're reading it. And what are the biggest challenges, would you say, Canadian companies face when trying to expand their footprint internationally in defense markets? And you touched on this a little bit already, but how might the government be able to help Canadian defense companies gain maybe more of a competitive edge outside Canada?
One of the big challenges on the export side is simply that a number of other countries are doing something similar in terms of emphasizing their domestic production. So Europe, yes, is going to be spending far more on defense capabilities, but that is coming with an investment, obviously, in the European defense industrial base. The United States is putting in place a number of measures to acquire higher end capabilities and new technologies more quickly, but is also understandably favoring the United States. And there's a number of other allies who are trying to export things to us. Think of the South Koreans, who have a lot to offer us in terms of capabilities, and that emphasis is really on their export potential. So the difficulty, or maybe not difficulty, but the challenge for Canada will be to undertake a very skilled export strategy and diplomatic strategy that ensures that our allies also look to us for capability. So I anticipate that the Canadian Commercial Corporation is going to need a bit of a top up and better resources to be able to do this, given our ambitions. And Global Affairs Canada is going to have to play a larger role in this. Even up to the Prime Minister and ministers are going to have to be more deeply engaged in selling Canada, as it were.
Over the past year or so, there has been a lot of talk of Canada joining the Rearm Europe or Readiness 2030 initiative. Was there anything in this budget that indicates steps Canada could take to further integrate with the EU in that regard, or was there anything mentioned about this initiative?
Not explicitly. There is, though, the hints that we are going to be moving on the defense industrial strategy. So I expect that we'll see more details there. There is also a commitment to aiding Ukraine and getting more involved in that area, which could see us build better defense ties with the Europeans. And I would just note as well that even in the background of what's happening here, we're seeing a lot of movement, in particular from Saab and others who are really making interesting offers to Canada around development of capability here in Canada. And even just this morning, we read that a French firm is interested in investing in Canada for munitions. So there is a lot of potential here. It's just a question of making sure that everything aligns so that we avoid as much as possible duplication with some of our closer allies and develop capabilities that they need and capacity that they need.
It would seem that one of the backdrops to this budget is our relationship with the United States, as well as changes in our relationship with the United States over the past year. You'll of course remember Mr. Trump's comments earlier about making Canada the 51st state. To what extent do you think these changes in the bilateral relationship seem to have impacted this year's budget? And how do you foresee the future of the bilateral relationship within the near to medium term?
I anticipate that a lot of the spending within the budget opens up potential, for example, for Canada to be more involved in continental defense vis-a-vis Golden Dome and other initiatives like that. That will in part, though, depend on the willingness of the United States to consider Canada contributing Canadian-made capabilities. If the United States tells us that we can only participate in Golden Dome with American capabilities and that we have to be a buyer, we can't be a contributor of our own capabilities, I suspect that will run afoul of the underlying principles that the budget is putting forward. That said, as you point out, the relationship with the United States and the uncertainty that's creating in various parts of the Canadian economy is the driving force behind this budget's investment in the defense portfolio in two ways. The first, there's a recognition now that in order to help the Canadian economy weather the current area of conflict with the United States, more needs to be spent on Canadian industry and government needs to buy more from Canadian industry. So that's a big piece of it. And the other part of it is this desire to clearly signal to the United States that we will be spending 2% of GDP on defense, and we are taking our defense commitments far more seriously. So that's the other piece to this.
Building a bit more off the bilateral relationship, and again, you did speak to this a little bit earlier, but I'm wondering what strategies you think Canada might be able to implement to ensure its defense industry doesn't become overly reliant on U.S. markets and maybe maintains long-term innovation and growth within our own borders, if that is a desire of the government.
Well, fundamentally, you need the Canadian government to be a buyer of Canadian defense industrial goods. If you want to convince Canadian defense industry to not look primarily to the United States as its market, then it has to come with some demand signal, either from other allies or from the Canadian government itself. So I suspect that that's going to be a big piece of this equation, is to what extent is the United States seen as a good-to-have market, but also complemented by greater demand on the part of the Canadian government and hopefully other allies.
So the creation of the Defense Investment Agency is intended to streamline procurement and accelerate the delivery of equipment to the CAF, but procurement delays have been a long-standing issue. So what are the critical challenges that the DIA might face in centralizing processes and ensuring that these timelines and costs are realistically assessed? And is there a worry that perhaps by creating another agency, you might be layering another bureaucracy onto the process, and that potentially you might not be solving some of the deeper cultural problems related to Canada's procurement challenges?
The DIA has a lot of potential, but as you point out, it faces a lot of challenges as well. DIA should not be a duplication of existing efforts, and thus far it doesn't look like it's going to be. We're seeing some effort to transfer functions and positions from other departments into the DIA. Presumably as well, and this is what I anticipate that the DIA will be focused on over the next little while, is what can be done to reduce the process and procedures and layers of oversight and other mechanisms that we've put in place that end up creating a very fair but risk-averse procurement system, which helps explain why it is so slow and cumbersome. That said, the DIA is going to face some challenges. It is difficult to set up something brand new while also trying to move a good amount of program. So that's going to be an interesting balancing act. How does DIA both reform things, transform things, and not get totally consumed by the machinery side of what it's trying to do, vice trying to move procurements faster. Similarly, as a number of venture capitalists and startups and small and medium enterprises have pointed out, DIA right now is only focused on projects and programs over 100 million. That creates some concern that it will only really focus on these big boulders within the capital expenditure portfolio and not improve processes for some of these smaller projects. Now, I anticipate that eventually that will be dealt with, but we'll see how long it takes them to widen that aperture for the DIA. And the final thing I'll say is I really do believe that DIA needs a better legislative framework. The Defense Production Act should be amended to empower that agency effectively. And similarly, I don't know how feasible it is to keep DIA under the responsibility of the Secretary of State when that Secretary of State is trying to influence processes and DIA is trying to influence requirement setting within D&D CAF. So we'll have to see how that plays out.
We also, of course, have a defense and industrial strategy forthcoming, focused on boosting Canada's defense industry and hopefully fostering more innovation. How quickly do you believe that funding, once available, would translate maybe perhaps into actual procurement or operational readiness? And do you believe that a defense industrial strategy might be able to overcome some of the bureaucratic hurdles that we've just been discussing?
I wouldn't expect the defense industrial strategy to deal with the bureaucratic side of things. I think it's largely going to be focused on building up the capacity on the industrial side, where I think, though, there has to be greater concern is the the defense industrial strategy, the DIS can't only be focused on boosting the supply side of the equation. It also has to ensure that the demand side, namely, is the government buying from the industries that it's funding. And that will be where we want to see greater clarity around what the CAF needs so that industry in Canada can start developing those capabilities. By the same token, we're going to want to see quite a bit more consideration and investment in terms of partnerships between government and industry and the CAF and industry so that research and development can occur in Canada and the CAF can acquire what Canadian industry is investing in.
We, of course, had Strong Secure Engaged a few years ago under the Trudeau government, and then we recently had a defense policy update. Given that we have a budget with substantial dollars going towards defense projects, do you see the potential for a kind of updated defense policy soon, once again, somewhere down the line?
I believe that an updated defense policy is required and is indeed a bit critical here. If the Carney government wants the CAF to think differently about what it's acquiring and what its requirements should look like, I would argue that needs to be expressed in some policy document. That needs to be clear direction. Otherwise, the CAF and Department of National Defense are simply going to stay the course on their current mission sets and requirements. We've been told, both by the Trudeau ministry and the current Carney ministry, that a national security strategy is being developed. And I would hope that once that national security strategy is published, if it ever is, that we then have a defense policy update that aligns with that national security strategy.
Considering the cyclical nature of defense spending in Canada, which we've talked about many times before, what steps do you think could be taken to ensure that the current push for increased defense investment remains sustained, even as political or economic conditions change and even as people's own attention spans change?
I think it's notable that we don't have clear support for this approach on the part of the Conservative Party at the moment. When the Conservative Party looks at the budget, it sees significant, massive deficits and additional debt. And a lot of that is being driven by these defense investments. So it's at a political level, we'll need to build support over the long term for this approach to the defense spending and to defense industrial investment on both sides of the aisle. Eventually, we will have a change in government. We don't know when, but even liberal governments don't last forever. Strange as that may seem, but they do eventually change. So you want to be able to have support for this overall approach within the two major parties. The second piece, I think, more looking at the liberal voters who have undertaken a pretty significant shift on defense spending over the past little while. And I think this is a bit of an anomaly, and we have to be careful here. I think there's a lot of faith being put on the part of traditional liberal voters in the ability of this defense spending to insulate the economy, to build the economy, to better productivity, to better investment. And all that needs to eventually bear fruit in relatively short order, I would argue, before the financial costs of this really start to mount and people start asking, well, is this sacrifice worth it? What are we getting for all this? This money that's not being spent on other things, is it actually producing the outcomes that we'd hoped?
Now, the commitment to NATO 2% GDP target this year and then 5% by 2035, I believe, is a pretty bold goal. How realistic do you think this timeline is? And does the budget indicator outline anything that would contribute to the steps required to get to that spending target?
So the 5% includes 3.5% of core defense spending and then 1.5 of defense adjacent spending. And the budget indicates that 1.5 is already going to be met through the investments that are outlined. So I think that dashed a lot of hopes of others who thought that maybe that 1.5 was going to be in addition to what's already being done. So there's going to be a bit of a reality check on that you can't put everything under the sun into that 1.5. That 1.5 is already pretty much accounted for, largely on the infrastructure side of things. In terms of the overall path to 3.5%, it is notable that the budget did not explicitly say what percentage of GDP its expenditures would lead us towards. So I think that is an interesting silence. I anticipate that it will get us above 2%, maybe to 2.5. And if we keep down this path, eventually the more you spend, the easier it will become to spend more. So I think that is a possibility, but bearing in mind again that 10 years is a long time. So we can get down that path, but a lot of things can happen between now and 2035.
Dr. Lagassé, for our more average or general knowledge audience listening to this podcast, let's say we do get to 5% defense spending eventually, coming from the percentage we're currently spending on defense, which is under 2%. How does that look on a more societal level broadly? I'm wondering if you could comment on that, help someone understand what going from under 2% to 5% might look like for Canadian society as a whole, or if it changes our society in any dramatic sort of ways.
It involves a fairly radical rethink of where government spends at the federal level. Over the past decades, the federal government has sought to create new social programs in cooperation with the provinces. It has sought to keep taxes at a relatively low level, all things considered. It has sought to keep debt and deficits as a portion of GDP relatively in check, with varying success. Going up to 5% of GDP on defense is just such a massive number. It will dominate almost all other discretionary federal spending. If it is accompanied by higher deficits and debt, the burden on future generations is going to be considerable unless we do find new ways of raising taxes to pay for it. And it may impact federalism itself, where the federal government is far less capable and interested in getting involved in social programs and things of that, or new social programs with the provinces. So it would involve a fairly significant shift in how Ottawa spends. And this is where I'm not fully convinced that we've properly prepared the population for that. I'm not fully convinced that we've prepared Ottawa for that. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to change the culture to make that happen.
Dr. Lagassé, thanks for joining me today. We have about 30 seconds left. I'm wondering if, again, for a general audience, we might be able to go full circle here and you might be able to offer your final reflections on the budget, or maybe drive home the significance of this year's budget for our audience.
Very quickly, the budget it provides a significant amount of investment in the defense portfolio over the next few years. It indicates that the Carney government is taking a pretty radically different approach to defense spending than governments we've seen really since the 1950s. And this is going to be accompanied by a fairly significant investment by the government in Canadian industry. And that is just something that we haven't been used to since the mid-Cold War. So we're undergoing a pretty radical shift, I would say, away from a neoliberal, as some would say, economic model to a much more government invested closely with industry in the defense sector.
Well, Dr. Lagassé, thanks once again for coming on the podcast. Always a pleasure to have you on, and appreciate you sharing your thoughts about the budget with us this morning.
Thanks, Josh.
And that's all for today's episode. The Expert Series is usually released every Friday. If you want to learn more about the CDA Institute, follow us on social media, visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates on Canadian defense and international security. If you have comments or feedback about what you heard in today's edition, email Josh at cdainstitute.ca. I'm Josh Malm. Until next time.